And the selection from this book that you're reading this week discusses questions of family, domestic affection that we were talking about in Frankenstein. Really applies to what Joan Roughgarden argues about sexual selection, that sexual selection is not just about breeding, but it's about reproducing healthy families. So looking at human reproduction in terms of broader, more complex kind of social forms of reproduction rather than just the nuclear family. It seems to imply a kind of poetry of the family, a kind of poet is what we've been talking about. Family is largely a function of the stories we tell about family, right? Reading Frankenstein from a feminist perspective is about paying attention to the lives of particular characters in the novel, but it's just about as much about paying attention to all these characters that we don't hear in the novel, this silenced demographic. So that haunting again. So this week's iteration of psychedelia is kind of darkly inflected, perhaps goth even, spangly goth. It's about artistic refinement of nihilism, sort of dancing on the grave. The conclusion of Byron's Darkness is as fine an example as we've seen, I think, of this use of poetry to kind of flaunt its own pointlessness in the void. So it's real fascinating play of personification and pronouns going on here. Forging, in Blake's terms, these metaprimal metaphors. She was the universe. Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death. It's another example of kind of erotic relationship to the void, with the sun of the children's playground sort of morphs into this dark, cold corpse in the ground. Edgar Allan Poe like repetition, the swelling of the ground, the cornice in the ground. It's haunting, death speaking to us through this rhythm. It's a key point to keep in mind reading The Amos Catch Fire, sort of the relationship between narrative and poetry. When does the narration sort of morph into visionary poetry? What's the relationship between narrating chronology, history, and poetry? As a representation of history itself. That's what I'm talking about, like the poetry of history. This critique, this dark, haunting. What's getting haunted is, the Ozymandias patriarchal regime of domination and power, as if we could cheat death, as if we could dominate nature. So Nietzsche imagines another kind of humanity that will evolve when we learn another kind of history. So here Nietzsche is calling on us to be responsive to history's losers. He who knows how to regard the history of man in his entirety as his own history feels in the immense generalization all the grief of the invalid who thinks of health, of the old man who thinks of the dream of his youth, of the lover who is robbed of his beloved, of the martyr whose ideal is destroyed, of the hero on the evening of an indecisive battle which has brought him wounds and the loss of a friend. But to bear this immense sum of grief of all kinds, to be able to bear it and yet still be the hero who at the commencement of a second day of battle greets the dawn in his happiness as one who has a horizon of centuries before and behind him. So to recognize that inheritance, being responsiveness to voices excluded from the medium that we're reading, excluded from writing, try to make our history, our story, responsive to that. So, Nietzsche's talk about heroism can seem to like maybe smuggle in a kind of triumphalism. But just to put in context Nietzsche's bombast, I want you to try to read it as Whitman-esque. He's a big fan, like Whitman, of Emerson. And so this kind of letting loose, a symptomatic expression of passion. You need words like hero for this kind of mythic, decentering of the master perspective. But what I want to emphasize is this heroism is, he's like Whitman singing the diversity of the world and the glory, the greatest glory ultimately of the sun. He becomes actually like Allen Ginsberg here, is to shine in the oars of the poorest fisherman. So it actually adds to the glory of the sun, the sunflower, to the meagerness of its reflection. So that emphasis on refinement, on experiment, what matters is what happens at the margins. That's what makes the sun feel richest. That's what I mean, like this poetic inflection that enters in here. Very Emersonian and Whitman-like, Whitman-esque. Song of Myself ends with Whitman saying, I'm out there waiting for you. Look for me under your boot soles. So I'm in the dirt. And that goes back to Frankenstein, this sort of being responsive to what the contemptible, that's what's at stake in reading. It's a different relationship to the text, to the book you hold in your hand. It's like breaking down the laws and opening the doors of perception to a kind of complexity that defies writing. So it's teaching you to start reading the world as like language. Bias has encouraged us to see our understanding as penetrating and clearing away the dirt and grime of accidents, of context, revealing the true concept of underlying things. Now we're in the Anthropocene, where the whole climate has become a kind of dirty reflection of our own pollution. So how do we escape ourselves? How do we find roots in this mess? That's an interesting way of thinking about the kind of roots that reading fosters. This familiar model, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, assumes that art and culture builds in a linear way on more basic physiological needs. But if we follow Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, who we are in the first place as a physiological organism can't be separated from cultural norms of reading. We, so to speak, stitch ourselves together, stitch identities together of individuality, relationships, family. We see that in Blake. The tiger isn't just objectively there or an objective, physiological threat. How we imagine the tiger determines what kind of a threat, how we relate to it on some sort of like physiological level. Likewise here in Byron, but two of an enormous city did survive. They lifted up their eyes and beheld each other's aspects, saw and shrieked and died. Even of their mutual hideousness they died. unknowing who he was upon whose brow famine had written fiend. It's a pretty interesting statement. Like Maslow, it seems to suggest famine turned them into fiends. Evil was caused by the lack of food. But look at the way he personifies famine as a writer. And fiend is a product of reading. Just like in the tiger, we read the tiger. The tiger is produced by the way we imagine it or project it in our imagination. And what do they die of? They don't die of famine. They die of hideousness. It's this perception of hideousness, the writing of fiend throughout the world, perceiving mutual hideousness in one another. It's not lack of food, it's this way of writing, way of reading hideousness, that we destroy each other. Leads us not just to destroy each other, but to void the world, bring time, history, time itself to an end. It's so fascinating. It had the surreality of this conclusion. He's using language to invite us to imagine a lack of time, utter lack of meaning. This is paradigmatic, sublime here. The world was void, the populous and the powerful was a lump. Seasonless, herbless, treeless, manless, lifeless, a lump of death. Again, it's like repetition of the word. It brings out this materiality in it, like Dickinson's repetition of the ground. A chaos of hard clay, the rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. So this is interesting. Do you notice anything here? Ships sailorless lay rotting on the sea. Their masts fell down piecemeal. As they dropped, they slept on the abyss without a surge. The waves were dead. The tides were in their grave. The sailorless ships are sleeping. So a weird kind of now the world has been voided. Time has been suspended. A chaos of hard clay, this inert materiality after the end of history. And yet Byron is personifying even that. So a weird kind of repopulation through the ghosts of the universe. I don't know what to call it in the context of in this post-apocalyptic context, but it does include a kind of personhood, personification. It's peopled. The winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid of them. She was the universe. Very interesting. Darkness had no need of aid. So, the universe beyond the end of the world does not need time, does not need human history, but we need poetic tropes like personification to evoke this universe. What I want to emphasize here is, Blake's point about all religions are one, and the universal poetic genius, or Coleridge's infinite I am. We're always creating the world through how we imagine it. We cannot avoid participating in this universal imagination or poetic genius. We use it to imagine even its absence, even the absence of humanity. The universe that's left over is gendered she, as that logically after the self-cancellation of patriarchal culture. But notice how this pronoun she is differently aligned relates differently to the material universe that it represents a neediness in us, the speakers, the writer, the readers, and a mystery in the universe. So the universe has no need of our language, imagination, and poetic tropes like personification. We need poetry and imagination in order to communicate about the universe. So after the narrative of human apocalypse collapse has finished, in the wake of that, the universe is repopulated through our sheer need to imagine it. Not through any claim to empirically understand the way the universe is populated. This is like the beginning of a new mythology, a new humble way of relating, humbly self-aware of the limits of what we can know, but the necessity of imagining, the necessity of imagining what we can't understand. It's like Dickinson's audacious, surreal visions, radically paradoxical. I take vaster attitudes and strut upon my stem. She's calling herself a plant that can walk, disdaining men and oxygen for arrogance of them. It's like just flaunting this radical capacity of imagination and poetry, re-engender the world. But again, like in Nietzsche's, poorest fisherman, re-engendering the world by instilling the most modest, the most humble, meager reality with majesty. Daisies in the ground, dirt under my boots.